Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website and remind our internet viewers that they can send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. For those here in-house, we would ask you to make that last courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And of course, we will post the program on our Heritage homepage within 24 hours for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our discussion today is Hella Dale, Senior Fellow for Public Diplomacy in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. Her work focuses on the U.S. government's institutions and programs for strategic outreach to the public of foreign countries, as well as more traditional diplomacy. She has written extensively in the past on newspaper for a weekly newspaper article on foreign affairs. She serves as a media fellow at the Hoover Institution, on the Board of Visitors at the Institute on Political Journalism and the Center for Free Inquiry at Hanover College, and is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please join me in welcoming Hella Dale. Hella?
Thank you, John. Thank you, and thank you to all of you for coming today, and for our panelists too for being here as well. And in a sense, thank you to the government for making this a very timely discussion. Yesterday, we got the news that the files about the Navy SEAL raid on Osama bin Laden had been purged from the Pentagon computers and sent over to the CIA, where presumably we will never hear from them again. This move happens to be done by the same administration that cooperated with filmmakers of Zero Dark 30 and who continuously builds itself as the most transparent in American history. So, thank you to the Pentagon's Inspector General who made sure that today's panel on overclassification and government secrets is as topical as can be. Our two speakers here are eminently well qualified to sort out the issue for us. Our first speaker will be Thomas Joscelyn. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and the senior editor of the Long War Journal. He's also a terrorism analyst, and most of his research and writing has focused on how Al-Qaeda and its affiliates operate around the world. Thomas Joscelyn is a regular contributor to the Weekly Standard, and he is the author of Iran's Proxy War Against America, published by the Claremont Institute. He has served as a senior terrorism advisor to Mayor Giuliani's 2008 presidential campaign, and in 2006 he was named one of the Claremont Institute's Lincoln Fellows. He holds a BA from the University of Chicago. Our second speaker will be Charles Colley Stimson, one of my colleagues here at Heritage, Senior Legal Fellow and Manager of the National Security Law Program in the Catherine and Shelby Colum Davis Institute for International Studies. Charles is a widely recognized expert in national security, homeland security, and crime control. A Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation since 2007, he became a manager of the National Security Law Program in the Davis Institute in April of this year. Prior to that, he survived a year as Chief of Staff for then-President Edwin Fulner. Before joining Heritage in 2007, Charles serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Detainee Affairs. He advised then-Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and coordinated the Pentagon's global detention policy and operations, including at Guantanamo Bay and in Iraq and Afghanistan. He is a third-generation naval officer, where he's a captain select and also serves as Deputy Chief Trial Judge. So with that, let us move on to our new speakers and welcome them. You may remain seated or standing, and Tom, you'll be first.
Either one?
Either, whatever you feel like.
I'm gonna sit down. Well, thank you, Hella. Thank you, Coley, and thank you, Heritage, for having me here today to talk to you guys. I was last here, actually, in 2005, And at the time, I was calling for more transparency out of the Bush administration on files that have been captured in Iraq and other related matters. And now, so flash forward here in 2013, you can see not much of my life has changed in terms of calling for transparency. The government continues to basically overclassify and keep hidden, I would say, voluminous amounts of material that need not be kept from the American public. Basically, just by way of background, I am basically a counterterrorism nerd, so I'm the guy who delves in the details. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the little nooks and details that probably most of you wouldn't care about, but I think that a lot of times the devil is in the details. And a lot of my, I'd say, urge or push for transparency revolves around the fact that a lot of those details I don't get access to personally, which I find to be a problem for me. So this is a very personal thing for me. In addition to, I think that in general, I think the government and its institutions, overclassify and keep stuff hidden from the public. That it really informs the debate. That could inform the debate. That would make a much more robust public discourse on our policies, whether you be left of center, right of center, whatever. And so that's sort of the consistent theme, I would say, or one of the consistent themes in my reporting through the years. In addition to, in 2005, like I mentioned, I was here talking about these files that were captured in Iraq, and what happened was that I don't remember the total number today, but it was in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of files were captured from Saddam's regime after he fell. This included hard drives, computers, that sort of thing. And basically, I caught wind of it, and some of my colleagues had caught wind of the fact that the U.S. government basically got all these files and then just sat on them. Didn't do much to translate them, let alone analyze them. Didn't do much with them at all, actually. And so we were using transparency at the time to say, well, if you're not going to do it, and you're just going to sit there and lock these away like the Ark of the Covenant in an Indiana Jones film, then at least let the public, and independent experts get a look at it and see what they say and have translations done, that sort of thing. In addition to that, after that, I also pushed for transparency on Guantanamo. If you look back at how the U.S. government sort of overclassified, I would say, things as simple as the detainee names at Guantanamo. I think that sort of detail really did not need to remain classified as long as it did. The Associated Press and other media organizations pressed for more information through a Freedom of Information Act request from Guantanamo. And as a result of that, in 2006, more than 10,000 pages of documents were declassified and released from Guantanamo. I'll say again, as the nerd who actually is interested in the details, I'm the guy who went through and read every single one of those pages multiple times, categorized them, highlighted them, figured out each and every detainee who had ever been held at Guantanamo, what their backstory was, what the evidence was for and against them as much as I could. So that's basically where I'm coming from. And I would say that after those files were released to the public, there was no real net effect to national security or detriment to the fact that that was released to the public. It's stuff that could have been put out there all along and didn't really need to have this pressure from the outside, from the media. Well, why am I giving you this backstory about Iraq, which nobody cares about anymore, and Guantanamo, which some people care about? Well, it's the same story today. And just as in Iraq, where all these files were captured after Saddam's regime fell, today I'm pushing for the further declassification and release of files from Osama bin Laden's compound. Okay, when the Navy SEALs went into bin Laden's compound on the night of May 1st, the 2nd of 2011, they were trained to go in, and they weren't just there to kill or capture Osama bin Laden and fight off whoever was there to defend him. They were there also to capture as much media, as they would say in intelligence parlance, or intelligence that they could via thumb drives, hard drives, books, whatever they could get their hands on, okay? And they went in with bags, and they filled those bags as much as they could. And then they filled so many of their own bags that they ended up looking to see what was around, and they found old gym bags, Al-Qaeda gym bags. Yes, they have such things. And we're filling those as well. And so they took this haul out with them and got on the choppers and flew away. Well, if you go through, and this is the single most important thing I'm going to say today. So just if you want to snooze after I say this, that's fine. But here's the single most important thing I'm going to say of this. When you cull out all of the extraneous stuff from these files that were captured by the Navy SEALs, and you cull out everything else, hundreds of thousands, okay, hundreds of thousands of documents and files were captured in bin Laden's lair. Okay, hundreds of thousands. Okay, think about that. Take a step back for a second. Hundreds of thousands. In fact, several of my sources and people who have gotten briefed on this sort of thing say that the number is actually over 1 million, and maybe approximately 1.5 million. Okay, documents and files. And this is after you remove bin Laden's porn and that sort of thing. Okay, that doesn't count. This is just the stuff that's left over. All right. So flash forward to last year in May of 2012. the Obama administration, actually on April 30th, 2012, John Brennan, who was then the senior counterterrorism advisor to President Obama, has a big speech at the Wilson Center, ironically enough, and you'll get the irony in a second, about government transparency. And he says that the president has encouraged me and his staff, other members of his staff, to be more transparent in the fight against terrorism and against al-Qaeda so that we can inform the public about what we're doing. And they can see, basically, and judge for themselves what we're doing. And as part of that effort, we're going to release some of the bin Laden files. That's part of our effort towards transparency. A few days later, through a shop at West Point, 17 files were released by the Obama administration, okay? Now, let's go back here. Hundreds of thousands of documents and files, right? You're saying you're transparent, and you release 17 of them, okay? That, by no measure that I can think of, reasonable or otherwise, is transparent, okay? Now, why is that important? Well, if you think about it, think about our world, certainly the world I've lived in, we all lived in since 9/11. These events have changed, all of our lives in one way or another, subtly or otherwise. And so, basically here we have the best source of information on this organization and these terrorists who changed our lives, and the U.S. government, which did not create the documents, okay, and which, there's a whole other story about how thoroughly they were all gone through, and I think there were problems there as well, but did not create them, certainly relied on them, but decided that it wasn't going to release most of them to the U.S. public, okay? Now, I think that's a travesty. I think this is the type of stuff that the American public should get to see. Why shouldn't journalists, TV stations, of left or right, whoever you are, I don't care. Why shouldn't everybody around the world get to see what's in these files, right? Now, some of them you could say are operationally sensitive, and they may touch on stuff that's going. That's true, okay? But, if you look back at how these documents have been described by the Obama administration, it's quite clear that they identified very early on more than 400 immediate threat reports out of the documents that had to be neutralized. These are immediate threats that bin Laden was managing. Okay, more than 400 immediate threat reports that they had to shut down. Does that stuff necessarily, all of it, need to be released to the public? No. Some of it probably could by now, but some of that you can still, if it's still ongoing, it's still relevant, it's certainly within their purview to keep it classified. But that's, okay, now more than 400 immediate threat reports, that still leaves aside, you're still in the hundreds of thousands of documents and files realm where we have other additional material that could, to my mind, and should be released to the public, okay? The vast majority of these documents should be released to the public, and they haven't been. So, why is that all important from your perspective? Okay, why would you be worried about it? Why is it not just the nerds who should be interested in it? Why should the American people be concerned about it? Well, one of the things that I've documented is when you go back to how the documents were actually described initially, okay, when they came out, there was this long-time assumption in the intelligence community that bin Laden was not really active in managing al-Qaeda anymore. He was basically held up somewhere, they thought in northern Pakistan or somewhere along those lines, which turned out to be false, but that he wasn't really that active in managing this international terror network anymore. Well, a week after the raid on bin Laden's compound, you can trace all these media reports that come out and say just the opposite. In fact, bin Laden was very actively managing this terror network and was very actively directing what was going on, okay? Well, that's a big deal, right? U.S. intelligence community, many people here in D.C. believe that he wasn't. Turns out he was, right? That's a big deal. And that raises all sorts of questions about, how he was protected in Abbottabad, his support network, all those sorts of things. But then you flash forward a year later to when those 17 documents were released. And something that most people didn't even notice happened, which is that the White House, basically John Brennan and others, changed the narrative, okay? The narrative had been bin Laden is very active. This is a coherent, cohesive terror network that we're fighting, and bin Laden is directing this thing to, nope, he was in retirement. He was a lion in winter. He had trouble communicating with anybody, and he was not involved with all the affiliates to any great degree. Well, that's kind of curious, isn't it? I can point to you, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, I don't know, media reports citing very specific information, including information that ended up being used in courts of laws around the world about bin Laden's ongoing role in managing al-Qaeda. And then a year later, the White House and their surrogates who then were reporting say the exact opposite. They say he wasn't involved in all this. He was out of the game. Well, I'd say there's only one way for us to really settle this, and I know what answer is right, and the latter answer is clearly wrong because there's just a lot of facts I could muster to show it's wrong. But there's only one way to poke through that narrative firmly so that everybody can see it, and that is to release the documents, right? Why should we, if you're really interested in transparency, let us see it. Now, I just asked a second ago, why are you interested in this? And I'll try and leave it on this note. Why should you be interested in this? Well, because it touches on so many parts of, the current war strategy, the current counterterrorism strategy, what we're doing, who we're fighting around the world, all sorts of things. We're clearly pulling out of Afghanistan currently, okay? And one of the big assumptions is that the Taliban, is something that is easily separable or can be separated from Al-Qaeda, and its interests are almost totally different from Al-Qaeda's. Well, one of the things that we know that was in the documents from bin Laden's compound that was not released to the American public, even though it made it to the press beforehand, were documents showing bin Laden colluded with senior Taliban commanders, including Mullah Omar, on a regular basis to plan attacks in Afghanistan, right? And these documents weren't released to the American public. Well, why weren't they released to the American public? I'll let you fill in and speculate as to why, but you think about it, this is the type of thing that would complicate a policymaker's job when you're arguing that we can get out of Afghanistan now, isn't it? If you have documents that show that Al-Qaeda is fighting in Afghanistan and is fighting closely with the Taliban and has interest in Afghanistan and has plans for Afghanistan, well, that becomes a problem. My view is I don't know what the right answer is on a lot of these policy questions, okay? But I know that none of this stuff should be withheld from the public as we're having the debate and the discussion, okay? And so a lot of the documents along this line, where it be Afghanistan or I'll give you another timely example. You're raising the Inspector General's report on what happened in Abbottabad with the files about the actual raid. Well, nearly simultaneously, this Pakistan's Abbottabad Commission released a report talking about, how is it that bin Laden ended up in Abbottabad? And the authors of the report went through all sorts of different hoops to try and fill in pieces of the story. And one of the things in the report that I haven't seen anybody mention yet, and I just read this on the train ride down here from New York, was that one of the big holes in their analysis was they didn't have access to bin Laden's files. And they say that. We can't give you definitive, answers about who was sponsoring or protecting or how bin Laden's support network was comprised here in Abbottabad and in Pakistan, because we don't have access to the best information out there. Well, that's the type of stuff that should be made public, to my mind. Shouldn't we know? Don't you have the right as an American citizen who's paying taxes and who's wants the best defense for your country that you can, to know each and every single individual or party who was helping to protect Osama bin Laden? I think you do. And I think that we have the right to know everybody who was mentioned in those documents along those lines. And they'll say, and people in government will say, well, it's sensitive, it's operationally sensitive, and these sorts of things. In some cases, it probably is. In many cases, I don't think it is. In many cases, I think transparency helps, because you can publicly shame parties out of, helping a group like Al-Qaeda. You can inform the debate better in terms of, enlightening some Pakistani officials who may be on our side in this fight about who are the real problems, that sort of thing. That's all, to my mind, a major reason for transparency. And I would say the consistent theme here that I can see throughout time is most of the Iraq files could have been declassified and released to the public for the public to see. They weren't. There was a whole other story there and how that was shut down. That effort was shut down. Most of the Guantanamo files could be declassified and released to the public. A lot of them were, and there was no real net effect, I would say, on national security. And most of the files found in bin Laden's compound should be released, declassified, and released to the public.
Great. Thank you. It's overwhelming. Holly, help us sort through all this. Why?
Well, thank you, Helen, and thank you, Tom. I actually have just come to the realization that in some way I'm responsible for Tom's success in his career because I've provided him not only as an obstacle to transparency when I was working in the Pentagon, because he was apparently trying to get information that I was able to declassify, but then also I was there running detainee policy when we released all those documents to give you more work. So let me know if I can help you out.
I can share my
in
binders
any
with you
other
if you want.
I'm going to obviously take a different perspective from this because I haven't been a journalist, nor do I care to play one on TV, and I want to sort of step back and amplify and talk about some of the policy implications and why I think overclassification is clearly pervasive, and then also talk about its related and evil twin, and that is leaking. and sort of talk about the interrelationship between the two. And, you know, as Hella said, I had the privilege of running detainee policy in the Bush administration for Secretary Rumsfeld and Gates. But before that, I was I picked up on something you said, Tom. I was a detail guy. I was a federal prosecutor and had been a military prosecutor and defense lawyer, and so details matter, facts matter, evidence really matters. And so my comments today obviously don't reflect that of the Department of Defense. They don't reflect that of the Department of Justice, and don't reflect that of the Navy or its JAG Corps, but they are informed by my experiences in all of them. I think it's frankly beyond dispute, and I challenge anyone in the audience to challenge us with the opposite conclusion. It's beyond dispute that there is a pervasive nature of overclassification in our government. I was very pleased to see that among the many distinguished guests we have in the audience today, there's somebody from the National Archives. So I hope if you're able to put a question to us during the question and answer period, because I suspect you see that throughout your career at the National Archives. But before we get into some of the reasons why we have a federal government culture pre-wired, in my opinion, to overclassify, and then the effects of that, I think we should just put on the table what we mean by overclassification. And this is where I might slightly differ with some of my friend Tom's comments, at least the ones that I thought were perhaps a little overbroad. And maybe it's just the New Yorker and you coming out, I don't know.
It's tough to keep contained.
I know. You can take the guy out of New York, but you can't
Yeah.
take the New Yorker out of the guy, yeah.
This is on one cup of coffee too, by the way. So
Imagine, if you had three. So, as you know, the federal government, and for those of you who've worked in it, you know this firsthand, is comprised of lots of agencies. And typically, when you think of classification issues, you think of what I call the big three. You think of the Department of Defense, you think of the CIA, and you think of the national security agencies, where there's lots of other government agencies that classify information. In fact, I can't think of many that don't. And perhaps our National Archives colleague here in the audience can talk about that in the form of a question. But I would assert that each, or most at least, of those agencies has a legitimate need to classify some things. And that's in order to protect critical programs or persons or sources and methods, or, for example, legitimate scientific or other technical capabilities we have. And I believe, quite frankly, that proper classification, not overclassification, but proper classification of these things promotes the security of our country and contributes to our public safety, and is necessary for the proper functioning of us as a world power. And concomitantly, if and when that properly classified information is released without proper authority, for example, by a leak, depending on what it is and how it is released, it can cause, and indeed has before caused, great damage to our country and our relationships with other countries. That's a key component here. Or individuals, both U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens. People have gotten killed over these leaks. And I would say, assuming the information or the program is properly classified, the higher the classification of the improperly leaked matter, the greater likelihood of damage to ourselves or allies or the persons involved in those programs. But my comments today aren't focused on properly classified information. I think we all sort of get the general concept that countries need to classify certain things. And I don't think that's your point either. You obviously would agree that we need to classify certain programs and certain information. But the pervasive problem of overclassifying, and it doesn't start with Tom's graduation from the University of Chicago. It doesn't start with my birth in '63. It goes way, way back. And numerous senior government officials over the decades have complained about overclassification. For example, my old boss, Secretary Rumsfeld, said in 1995, quote, "I have long believed that too much material is classified across the federal government as a general rule," unquote. This president issued an executive order back in 2009. It's for you detail nerds, it's Executive Order 13,526. And I reread it again in preparation for this. I found some rich language from that I thought you would enjoy, especially given your comments, Tom. Quote, "This order prescribes a uniform system for classifying, safeguarding, and declassifying national security information. Our democratic principles require that the American people be informed of the activities of their government. Also, our nation's progress depends on the free flow of information both within the government and to American people." And further down in the executive order, there's a section called Classification, Prohibitions, and Limitations. Quote, "In no case shall information be classified, continue to maintain as classified, or fail to be classified in order to 1. Conceal violations of the law, inefficiency, or administrative error, 2. Prevent embarrassment to a person, organization, or agency, 3. Restrain competition," etc., and it goes on. Now, think about that in light of what Tom talked about it. But I'm going to talk about it in a more historical context first and then bring us to the present. One of the more recent studies that I would commend to your attention is, that deals with overclassification is by two folks from the Brennan Center for Justice. Now, I don't typically quote Brennan Center for Justice studies, and I don't necessarily support this conclusion, but they do a nice job in their report laying out the problem of overclassification. And they note in that study there have been numerous government studies over the decades to include high-level special committees or commissions that study it. And just listen to the breadth of these commissions. In 1956, the Coolidge Committee concluded, among other things, quote, "Overclassification has reached serious proportions," unquote. 1957, the Wright Commission. The president of ABA was named after the Wright Commission, and he conducted that study. Similar conclusions. 1958, the Moss Subcommittee, looking at DOD. It said unnecessary secrecy ranged from the amusing to the arrogant. 1970, the CITES Task Force. Quote, "The volume of scientific and technical information that is classified could profitably be decreased by perhaps as much as 90%. 1985, the Stilwell Commission. Navy members, this dealt with the Navy members charged with espionage, and they concluded, quote, "Too much information appears to be classified," unquote. Very lawyerly weasel word, appears to be. I can say that as a lawyer. 1994, Joint Security Commission, quote, "The classification system has grown out of control," and then 1997, the commission headed up by former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, quote, "The classification system is used too often to deny the public an understanding of the policy-making process," unquote. I think that sort of picks up on one of Tom's main themes. And former CIA Director Porter Goss testified in 2003 before the 9/11 Commission. Some of you, which may have read that commission report, said, quote, "We overclassify very badly. There's a lot of gratuitous classification going on." And let me just state anecdotally, as a naval officer, when I came to the Pentagon to work on detainee matters back in 2006, I people assumed I knew what to classify and what not. When you're a senior government official and you're appointed by the president to go take on a job where there's classified information, you don't get a training program, you don't get a video, you don't get a 2-week course on what to classify. You sit down at your desk, you figure out where the bathroom is, and in front of you there's a classified computer and an unclassified computer, and then there's a security officer who reads you into security protocol, and then off you go. And oftentimes, inevitably, you inherit programs that are already classified, and then you continue to classify going forward. There's no incentive to declassify. And you get FOIA requests and you get these other requests, but there's no institutional incentive to declassify, even knowing that there are these executive orders out there from the president you serve and other presidents before him. So, from a policy matter, how do you address the disparity between the actual rules in place? Because many of these commissions made recommendations, some of those recommendations turned into rules. How do you address the disparity between the actual rules designed to minimize the amount of classification of information every day and the tsunami of overclassification that happens every day. But one way that it happens in the government, although this isn't the preferred method, although it just happens and has happened since the Republic, is leaking, strategic leaking. And I'm not aware of any study out there that has looked at and compared, for example, the amount of overclassification with the amount of strategic leaking by executive and senior executive branch officials. But I suspect if there was a study out there, they would find that it's directly proportional. The more overclassification there is, the more strategic leaking there is. And again, more summer reading for you. If you want to read about a really good upcoming law review article on leaking, there's a draft of a Harvard Law Review article by law school professor David Posen up at Columbia called "The Leaky Leviathan: Why the Government Condemns and Condones Unlawful Disclosures of Information." And he argues the following, and I think it's an interesting point to make before I close and turn it over to questions. He says that, quote, "The story behind the U.S. government's long-standing failure to enforce laws against leaking is far more complicated and far more interesting than has been appreciated." And he opens his law review article, which is very long, by stating, quote, "Ours is a policy saturated with, vexed by, and dependent upon leaks," unquote. He notes that we have laws in place that punish the source, the leaker, but not the distributor, the media. And that for First Amendment and other constitutional reasons, you don't want to you don't want to punish or sanction the distributor. You want to focus your attention on the source, the leaker. But that when you really peel back and look at this, it is much more complicated because the government actually relies on strategic leaking to advance its policy goals, its need for increased transparency, understanding on the other side that there's overclassification, and its need to push forward its agenda. And so, obviously, the recent examples you can think of, many come to mind, I'm sure. Stuxnet is one. The terrorist surveillance program, where a colleague of mine from the Department of Justice, Tom Tam, talked to the New York Times. So I'll leave you with a suggestion, but I'd be curious to see if there are others that are more intelligent or thought out than mine. But one of the ways I think you have to start to address this problem of overclassification is you have to start with training the people who come into these positions about whether or not something should actually be classified. And there needs to be a system, a programmatic system in place to help them delineate about whether something actually needs to be classified. And the programs that are there on their computer, you literally open up an email on a certain computer and it automatically defaults to secret when you're on the SIPR. I mean, is that really necessary to send somebody an email saying, "Hey, Brian, you want to go to lunch at noon," and it be classified forever so that 30 years later some of the National Archives can read that and say, "Who's Brian?" I don't think so. And so I think part of the solution is training and forcing people in government, especially senior government officials, to think and to ask themselves, does this really need to be classified? And if not, let's create incentives within the executive branch so that the default is not classified. The default is not classified unless the following happens. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, well, we got about half an hour for questions. I'm sure we got lots of them already. One down here in the front. We have a microphone, and if you'd be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation before your question.
My name is Luca Gattonicelli. I can neither confirm nor deny that I work for the American Spectator. And my reason for being here, and I think the reason of a lot of people, is the NSA leaks. So discuss, I guess. I'd love to hear what you guys have to think.
Well, I've been covering, I'm just going to take a step back from the NSA leaks for 1 second and talk about WikiLeaks and then the NSA leaks, because it's all part of the same thing, which is sort of this very agenda-driven leaking. This is sort of the opposite side of government officials trying to control the narrative that benefits the government. These are anti-government activists who are trying to control the narrative about what's, in these materials that they're leaking to the public. Part of my observation on that is that too often times the initial narrative that those groups like WikiLeaks or Snowden or these others want to sort of push forward catches despite the evidence. So they'll be leaking documents to the public or to press that then goes to the public. And what gets carried to the public is not so much necessarily the contents of what's been leaked, although that's in there and that can be very damaging. But a lot of times it's about controlling a narrative. Okay, and I'll give you an example with the original WikiLeaks stuff when they were releasing all these Afghan war log and Iraq diary and all this other stuff that came out. Was that Julian Assange said that this showed this pervasive sort of war crimes by the American military, and this showed that the war effort was just really about all sorts of bad things the U.S. military was supposedly doing. And I'm certain you can point to those some instances along those lines. However, that's not what the document showed, even though that's the narrative that was carried forward. In fact, when I went through the documents very carefully and went through the databases and found sort of what the most egregious sort of casualty-causing incidents were in them, they were all about our enemies. They were about Iran-sponsored groups, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, these types of things, and that was not the narrative that was the public first got. I'm using that as a backstory because when you come to Snowden, what do you have? Okay, you don't have this is just a plain factual reporting about what's in the documents. You have an agenda. The documents are leaked to sponsor an agenda, and to my mind, a lot of the early reporting on it, you see how it was rewritten. You see what happened in some of the early press accounts of what was in the documents, where you had, I think it was the Washington Post had to rewrite, substantively rewrite an article about what was in the documents, and others have been doing that a long way. Why is that? Well, it's because journalists get caught up in the act of leaking and reporting on the leak, and they think that they have something more than they do. I think that in that case, to Coley's point about protecting national security and certain information needs to be classified, to my mind, based on what I know about the NSA's programs and those sort of things, this clearly qualifies as something that should remain behind closed doors. However, I would say that I am very much a privacy advocate as well, and I'm always concerned about anybody having my data. So it's not something where I want to give a blank check to anybody. As long as there's proper oversight and those types of things are in place, then I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I have a problem. I have a problem. I don't know if any of you shop at Target, but you go into Target and they collect your personal data, and they're doing all sorts of things to figure out who you are. And when my wife was pregnant, we got an increase in the number of pregnancy ads, and it was done very subtly. And I learned afterwards why, and that's because they had a whole program to figure out what we were buying, and if that indicated, my wife was pregnant. I didn't know that at the time. I just sort of noticed it as hey, there's a lawnmower and then diapers next to it. This is kind of interesting. I hadn't seen that before. So what I'm saying is all these parties are collecting your information, whether it be private companies, U.S. government. When it comes to the U.S. government, the big thing to my mind is with something super secret like the NSA program, that's where the quality of oversight needs to be high. The more important the program is for national security, the more classification it requires, to my mind, means the amount of oversight needs to increase proportionally as well.
I'll dispense with the WikiLeaks piece very quickly. The Secretary of Defense has ordered all military personnel, including reservists, not to read or access those documents, and obviously I've complied with that order, so I haven't read any of them.
I read a lot of them. So.
And with respect to your question about the NSA and that particular leak, imagine the following thought experiment. All of you are commissioned officers in the military now. You all are read into certain sensitive access programs, special access programs, as part of your responsibilities. You're stationed throughout the world, and you all remember this day at Heritage when you were here for a lecture on overclassification on a hot, balmy summer day, and you decide, what, I think we're all at the same time just going to stick illegal thumb drives in our computers, pull off the sexiest stuff we can, and disclose it all to WikiLeaks. You would be outraged. American people would be outraged at that. And the only difference between that and this troubled young man who violated his oath is the scale. That's it. And so I don't think he's a hero. I don't think he should be applauded for what he did. I think he's a criminal. And I think he should be hunted down and prosecuted to the full extent of the law and put in jail for the rest of his life. And I think that unless and until we do that for people who take the law in their own hands, then we create an environment where other people think it's cool or it's tolerated. And I don't think that that's acceptable.
Okay, follow up here?
Gerald Chandler, no organization. Do you think we have a general bad climate since the Pentagon Papers because we didn't have enough prosecution then?
I think that's a great question, Mr. Chandler. It's interesting, in preparing for our time together today, I mentioned several articles that I was reading, and in particular, the Brennan Center study goes into that. But the one that really struck me is this Harvard Law Review article that's in draft form now, but available on SSRN. And in that article, the professor makes the point, I agree with it, that understanding that there is a pervasive nature and selective strategic sense of leaking throughout administrations, and the volume goes from leaks from the White House, which happen every week across administrations, down to other people, especially political appointees at the lower level, who need to cozy up to nice reporters from New York and give them dribs and drabs so they stay on their good side.
Wish there were more people like that.
I never leaked anything to you.
No.
But I think you're a good guy. It oftentimes is not in the government's long-term interest to hunt down and prosecute, ultimately, the leaker. There are administrative sanctions, including termination of employment. There's denial of access to sensitive programs. You may have a somewhat different view than me, but I think and we talk about the government as if it's a living being and it's controlled by one person. It's not. But the broad institutional interests oftentimes of not doing anything to further potentially reveal additional information during the prosecution of leaks tends to result in not prosecuting because during the disclosure and discovery phase, oftentimes you'll have to disgorge yourself of other materials that could support a defense, that would be ordered by a judge. And so once you get down to the nitty-gritty of really thinking through how one would have to put together a case to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person violated the Espionage Act or some other 18 U.S.C. criminal code, I think this is one of the very main reasons you don't see prosecutions going forward. It's a good question, though.
I'll just say one quick thing there. Pentagon Papers, the way that the Bin Laden documents have been described to me are the Pentagon Papers of Al Qaeda, and to my mind, that's the sort of thing as the nerd again I want to see. So, but I necessarily want somebody to leak those. No, but I think we should, have better systems in place for declassifying and releasing them.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to follow up or?
I wanted to follow up on the part that you said. Do you want me to take the microphone?
Yes, please.
Yeah, let's do that.
Actually, I've read quite a bit about Enigma and all the World War II secret stuff, and I've had some actual small part in those things. And one of the things, of course, people are very concerned about is methods and not letting the enemy know what you know.
Sure.
And in particular, I'd like you to comment on if you list even who you have captured, that can help them. I particularly think of General McChrystal's book about how he interrogated certain people, and they tried to keep it secret as long as possible that they had captured them, because once it's known that your buddy, your agent, is captured, the people who are associated with him are going to disappear into the woodwork. So I'm going back to your remark, Mr. Jocelyn, that you want to list things that prima facie seem to me a bad idea because you reveal to your enemies what you know.
No, it's a good question, but there's a specific reason why I say that. And Al-Qaeda knows who was captured, okay? When Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was captured in March 2003, his hard drives contained voluminous lists of all the mujahideen who have been captured by the U.S. since 9/11. They were keeping track very carefully of who was in, and they had a pretty good idea of who was at Guantanamo. So this wasn't the type of thing where we were preventing our enemies from gaining insights into our counterterrorism measures. We were basically just not informing the public about what was going on. The U.S. government was, not we, but U.S. government we. So from that perspective, I mean, if in certain situations, if you had a high-value terrorist, for example, who you think you could keep it quiet, that you've captured him and you want to interrogate him outside, off the grid, let's say, I totally buy the argument that that's the type of thing you don't want to release right away to the public. However, when you have something where, like Guantanamo, where you have, and I'm not talking even necessarily 2002 when the facility's open, we're going to release a list of who's there. But a couple years later, let's say, or 2003 or 2004, by that point, certainly that information is known. Certainly it's been communicated, in those channels, and that's not the type of thing that the U.S. government should be any longer in the business of basically keeping from the American public. That's sort of where I draw the line.
I will add a little flavor to that, Mr. Chandler, because I think the premise of your question is exactly right. We should all remember that in the grand scheme of things, since 9/11, we've held over 100,000 people. Many were repeat customers, most in Iraq. 779 total in Gitmo, a couple, 10,000 or so in Afghanistan, some of whom were repeat customers as well. But very early on, in fact, December 18th, 2001, when we had the first big bringing together of detainees in Bagram, the International Committee of the Red Cross was there to process them, as is their purpose. And within the few days of first getting to Gitmo, the detainees who were first brought there, the second week in January 2002, the International Committee of the Red Cross was there to provide their services to them, including, but not limited to, allowing them to write and receive letters with their family. And so inevitably their family, there were no prohibitions against their family informing other people that they were there, and in fact that happened. I do think that there were good reasons early on, although I wasn't at the Pentagon there working on detainee policy. I was recalled to active duty, like many people were right after 9/11, and served my year not doing detainee stuff, of why we wanted to keep those names from the public view. We didn't know how long the war was going to last. We didn't know which detainees knew what. We didn't want the enemy to know which detainees we had because they could assume that some were talking. And indeed, many were voluntarily talking to interrogators at that time. The number has gone down a lot since then.
I don't think any of them are talking to interrogators today, by the way.
They are, and they are, and
that's good news.
When in that time continuum, it made sense from a policy perspective and from a transparency perspective to release the names, I think is subject to a good, healthy debate. The fact is the Obama administration, 2 weeks ago, finally released the names of the 166?
Yeah, actually, the list is the 240 who were evaluated by the Guantanamo Review Task Force, and how they should be treated, whether they should be tried, held indefinitely, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it's been out, now it's out in 2013 versus 2002. So,
well, I would say just the one thing on that I would say just to add is that on Guantanamo in particular, the holding back information, I would argue, as the guy who's been defending why some of these guys were held in the first place, why these Guantanamo detainees were there in the first place, that the lack of transparency absolutely hurt the Bush administration in certain ways. Now, that's not an argument you'll hear a lot of times from a lot of people, but that's my considered judgment, having read through everything, that basically what happened was there was this information vacuum where the attorneys, surrogates, whether it be their lawyers or family members, were pitching one version of events in a story to the public, to the press, about who they were, when what the U.S. government had compiled through interrogators, through other hard evidence that was collected on the battlefields, told a very different story. What happened was the U.S. government did not, in any systematically way, communicate that through the media or through the public or anybody else. And I think secrecy got in the way of perhaps, doing a better job of communicating that. And so, I've done battle with former Guantanamo detainees who paint a picture of themselves which is completely, the opposite of the truth of who they were and who they are. And I just factually go through even stuff they've written since they got out of Guantanamo and show that it doesn't line up. And yet, I constantly have people come to me, even from the UK, where this is a really big problem, and say to me, why doesn't the U.S. government say anything about what these guys are alleging or accusing? I say, because now the Obama administration has no desire to defend Guantanamo being, being open. And back during the Bush administration, there was a penchant for secrecy and also a penchant to basically think that we're doing the right thing. We need to figure out, all the details here. They didn't really understand, I don't think, the public relations fight that they were in on all this stuff. And so that's just one, interesting dynamic in all this I don't think you hear a lot of people talk about.
I think by the time the Bush administration figured out that they really needed to be transparent in the maximum extent possible across all detainee policy and detention facilities, including Gitmo. I was late in the Bush administration, the second term. Secretary Rumsfeld said that in so many words to me. We need to open this place up for the world to see and let them decide. That's why we took so many folks, including congressmen and European delegations, to Gitmo. But by then, I think, to Tom's point, a lot of the narrative had been set. And so, that's just one example of many other examples within the government, I think, where the default of overclassification tends to hurt the policy goals and narrative of an administration, when in fact the starting point shouldn't be classified, should be not classified unless or until, and then you fill in the blanks of why it should be classified. I think there was a question in the back.
Good afternoon. Johanna Markind. I'm just here as a private citizen. This builds off of some comments that Mr. Simpson made, but it's addressed to both speakers. Do you think that inertia and bureaucratic caution favor overclassification, and can you suggest ways, other than having the computer default to classified, practical ways of reducing overclassification?
Oh, that's a great question. I think Coley actually started to lay down some of the groundwork for how to do that internally to the bureaucracy, which I think was great. I never thought along those lines, but that's mainly because I've never been on the inside either. But that's a great way of starting to approach from the inside. But I think, one of the things is I think, the media's FOIA requests are helpful in increasing transparency and showing what can go out there in some regards. I think also oversight can do more in terms of, generating more information from, these government bureaucracies. I mean, just to give you an example of how absurd some of this overclassification can get, I was looking through the CIA's, I think it's the CIA's FOIA site, and they had a document from before World War I about secret handwriting, which was just declassified in the last couple of years, okay? Now, I'm pretty sure this doesn't compromise any methods we're using currently to, hunt down our adversaries around the world. I'm pretty sure this is not super secret stuff. That's the level of absurdity. But, I mean, you could conceivably have, the bureaucracy would fight this tooth and nail, but you could conceivably have an independent entity, some sort of, inspector of some sort go through and say, hey, why can't we, declassify a large portion of these holdings? Just start with even stuff from 1990 and before, or 1995 and before, something along those lines. I think the more oversight or independent accountability in my mind, the better. But
Well, I'm certainly not for more government and creating more agencies to watch the agencies
That's true.
and the sub-agencies.
That's a good point.
But to your question, Joanna, I think, especially to the inertia piece, there is no incentive structure in place not to classify. There's no reprimand, there's no censure, there's no negative performance evaluation, there's no... Once you classify this document, and speeches I gave when I was at the Pentagon to an internal audience who were just on detainee stuff, I'm sure those are classified. I'm sure some person who hasn't been born yet who then ends up working at the National Archives will read it and go, man, that was a really bad speech. And there's just no negative repercussions for classifying something to the person who does it. And so I think you have to add in, I think you have to start with training. And then I think you have to radically rethink the incentive structure within these agencies so that if a person, like to Tom's point, let's say the IG, and every agency has an IG, does spot checks or has the ability in looking through the computers in the agency, who's the biggest, this guy, John over here, everything he touches, he classifies. Well, if he's a GS4 and really all he's doing is transportation stuff for somebody else, is there a reason for John, through his computer system, to be classifying everything? And you have to upend the system so that you can go to John and say, hey, John, I know you're classifying requests for lunch boxes to be brought to our office, but I don't really think you need to be doing that, even though it's being brought into a SCIF, a Secured Compartmentalized Information Center. So I think it starts with training, and I think you have to upend the incentive system for people to realize, or at least think more than once about, I actually don't need to classify that. And I think over time, and it's not going to happen overnight, you might be able to beat back this Leviathan.
And just one other, can I just add one quick thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Ultimately, it's an executive branch issue, more than anything else, and it comes from the top down. And what's really required is to have a president or senior advisors of the president understand these issues, understand that this is something that they can take care of at the highest levels that gets around all the bureaucratic machinations. If President Obama really wanted to have the most transparent administration in the world, he could have it, right? I mean, he's the president. Who's going to tell him no? He can declassify anything he wants. So it's just that simple. But the problem is that these types of issues don't resonate out in the populace like this. They don't become these types of political issues where the executive sort of has their hand forced.
I mean, imagine if you were deputized, Johanna, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Declassification. Not many people are going to return your calls. I mean, it's not like the sexiest job. It's the political pointy job that nobody else wanted, and you got it because you were the brother of the cousin of the brother to the senator, who's the cousin of the president.
Well, let's have one more.
Stefan Bielski, no relevant affiliation. Maybe you're up with the current numbers, but I understand there's something like 800,000 or 1.5 million people that have secret or top secret clearance in the U.S. So isn't this sort of a vicious circle in that you have all this information, all this data, so Leviathan needs an army just to manage it. And then, of course, once people have this, they want to keep it, they get pay raises just for having top secret. They have more opportunity. So it's in their interest to create more top secret stuff and say that they have experience of dealing with top secret, whatever it is, whether it's lunch boxes or launch codes.
I mean, I agree. I think a big part of the game here in Washington is that getting a security clearance, and then you're bought in the system, you get the pay raises, you can be part of the whole process, the whole system, and that, that does not create any of the incentives that Coley's talking about to declassify anything, because you're part of the in crowd now, you're part of the clique, right? And that's how you get paid. So it's a great thing to have all this information classified. That's why I doubt at any point in time there will be any serious transparency from within the bureaucracy itself, because there's one of many reasons why I just don't think that would come about.
Stefan, I would hope, because I very much appreciate your question, I think it's a good question, that the incident with this troubled young man and the role of contractors is really looked at, because or Army privates or whomever, there is a legitimate reason to stovepipe information across organizations. But there's also a problem with that, because it's a catch-22. If you stovepipe it, then you're not necessarily sharing it. If you're not sharing it, you're not necessarily catching some of the things you need to be catching. That's why, for example, in theory, the NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center, operates as sort of the Indianapolis, the crossroads to everything for information, and is allowed and is organized to be able to stitch together these mosaics of information. But I agree. I don't know what the numbers are today. I thought it was close to 1 million. It could be 800,000. It's a lot. But there's a lot of bad stuff out there. I don't know what the right number is, but I know that the incentives aren't right now. And that's, I think, to Johanna's point, you got to get the incentives right, and you got to get the training started. If the president said to his cabinet officials, Secretary Stefan, Secretary Johanna, Secretary whomever, your priority in the next year is going to be to make declassification a priority going forward, and you're going to put, my national security advisor is going to come up with a training program that's going to be enforced on all these people. That's a step forward, and it's a step we haven't had yet.
Yeah, sure.
Just one really quick thing. I think it highlights the absurdity of some of this, that one Army private can basically use thumb drives or however else he did to download 250,000 State Department cables, all this other voluminous information to get it out there. On the one hand, you have this vast machine that's created to basically classify all this stuff, and on the other hand, you can have a guy sit down at a computer and download this incredible amount of information and put it out there. It shows you there's like a real disconnect really between what's happening inside, right? I mean, it's sort of, obviously this stuff is not really as secret in many cases as it should be if an Army private can sit down and download it.
Yeah, true. I mean, also we're dealing with so much more information than we ever have before. That
Well, data, I don't know how
Data,
informational
yes.
it is, but
So
data,
it is right
yeah.
there.
stuff. Yes.
Yeah.
One last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Hi, thank you. I'm Charles Coburn. I'm a private citizen here out of interest. I'm curious, you sounded very critical of Mr. Snowden's effort. Is there any, in your view, both of you, is there any case when a whistleblower, blowing the whistle is justified? I mean, when declassifying documents yourself, stepping outside, your purview is justifiable.
Yeah, absolutely. As a former law professor, I can come up with tons of hypotheticals for you, but I could see, for example, if Brian, let me pick on Brian again, who's a colleague and friend of mine, is working at a government agency, and he runs across an illegal program that is just absolutely illegal, and he takes it to his boss, and he says, pound sand, and he takes it to his boss over here, and she says, pound sand, don't talk about it again. And he runs it up the chain, and then he uses the whistleblower function within the administrative state, and they tell him to pound sand. I think you get to a point where he's fully justified, understanding the risks, in leaking. And then, to Mr. Chandler's point, the paucity or low number of prosecutions as a result of it, Brian may be one of the lucky ones who's not prosecuted. So I can envision a number of different scenarios. That's just one.
And just to follow up on that, there are actually means and methods for people to be legitimate whistleblowers, to go up on the Hill and to get whistleblower protection. You can get that.
Yeah, there's a qui tam act.
Sure.
Yeah.
Snowden wasn't interested in any of that. Snowden was out there for a whole different agenda. I mean, this is a guy who was talking about how he could sit down at his computer and tap any phone he wants. This is not somebody who's living in my reality. This is not, this is somebody who's got his own whole agenda, his own whole narrative he wants to put forward. If he literally could do that, right, and jeopardize my security and my privacy, then yeah, I'd want to know, right? But he can't, and this is just sort of his own faulty narrative, and there's a big difference there. If he had legitimately stumbled upon something that was, rightfully or, wrongly illegal, and, he was a real whistleblower and went to the Hill and did his whole thing, then that's a whole different situation from, I'm going to put out my narrative about this and, go to guys that I know are going to basically help me get my narrative out to do it.
It doesn't mean it's easy.
And
No.
it always has a price.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for a totally fascinating discussion, and thanks to all of you for coming. Please stay for lunch.
Great.